As Jean has highlighted for us today as well, one of the interesting nuances around the immigration programs, of course, is that most of the people that are coming into the country are coming here with languages other than French or English. And to speak a little bit about this here, we're going to bring up Dorte Weber today to talk a little bit about how ESL instruction and that is affecting the process and what it may look like as we go forward with changes in programs. So with that, I bring up Dorte.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk about the language and assessment sector in Alberta and the state of affairs from our point of view. I'll go over some main points and then look at how we're doing in those areas and then talk about gaps and about the strengths that we have in the system. The importance of language really can't be overstated. Competence in an official language is the primary settlement tool, and for this reason I'm really pleased to represent the language sector today. I see this as a first step to what I think should be a much stronger partnership with settlement agencies. Currently, the language sector is considered I believe by governments to be just one aspect of settlement. However, the language sector represents the lion's share of the funding. And the language sector, by virtue of spending a tremendous amount of face-to-face time with immigrant learners, automatically serves as a settlement function, explaining aspects of Canadian life to newcomers and assisting them with their struggles. Within the sector and between the sector and government, language and assessment are currently represented by settlement agencies that are not necessarily fully aware of the issues that arise within language programs. Language is the primary settlement tool for employment, for advancement, for re-entry into professions or careers, for community engagement, to support children in school and in community life, for access to citizenship and for informed citizenship. In short, language is a vital part of every aspect of settlement. Integration is unsuccessful where language needs are not met. Language assessment, it's very high stakes for our learners. Applying to become a permanent resident or a provincial nominee or a citizen or a nurse, vet, pharmacist, to get into any post-secondary study, all of these require language assessment. Getting the right test at the right time is a challenge for newcomers, and it's not all tests are equally valid or equally regarded. Learners are often confused about which tests they need for what purposes. A better understanding about the correlations between different tests would help, and also better articulation and recognition of the different kinds of tests to sort of cut down on retesting, an enormous amount of retesting that takes place. But I'll give you an example. A link certificate is accepted as proof of language proficiency for citizenship. But we know that the CLB bands are very broad and somewhat elastic, and that not all link programs are equally rigorous, and that not all link instructors are equally expert in assessment. And so we have a very high stakes assessment without the assurance of high accuracy. Both CIC and the Government of Alberta use the Canadian language benchmarks and the Canadian language benchmark testing to define and express language proficiency and language skills gains. There are many great things about the CLBs, and I wouldn't wish to ever get rid of them, but as a program director for a post-secondary institution's ESL program, I can tell you that there are some concerns. For one thing, employers don't broadly recognize or understand the CLBs. The descriptors are still very long, wordy, and too broad to be of very much use to anyone who isn't an expert. This makes the link certificate of very little value to future employers. For another, the CLBs don't do a very good job of addressing academic language skills when actually these skills are all important for anyone who needs to take any kind of post-secondary program to reach their career goal. I'll mention professional development again later, but at this point I'll just say that the training that link instructors receive to become better CLB assessors in connection with, for example, the portfolio-based language assessment, link certificate, etc., this training is a one-time thing. And when there is recalibration, it's optional, it's not necessarily rigorous, and it's not always done with those who are most qualified. Well, at MacEwan University we run the IELTS test. It's just one of the several tests that we run at MacEwan, and it is an enormous project because of all that's involved in IELTS. Anybody who knows anything about IELTS knows how involved it is. It's a very high stakes test, and generally speaking, when you're talking about a very high stakes standardized test, It's absolutely necessary for assessors to retrain, recertify, recalibrate their assessment skills regularly. We're talking about several times a year. Without this recalibration, they do not assess. It's as simple as that. It's a required part of every high-stakes test I know of, with the exception of the CLB-based ones. Okay, are we on to the next one? Right, funding priorities. CIC funds link programming in Alberta up to link 5 or 6, which is generally around a CLB 5, 6, or a little higher for many individuals. In Ontario, CIC funds link programming up to CLB 9, I understand. I'm not sure why there is this discrepancy, particularly in a federal program, but I do know that newcomers in Alberta need language skills well above CLB 5 and 6. Luckily, the province funds ESL at all levels, and this funding supports many newcomers and citizens in reaching their career goals. It looks like a system working perfectly, and I can't stress this enough. The newcomers are grateful for the support they receive, and ESL professionals in Alberta are very, very well aware of the value of what we have, particularly when we go to national conferences and compare with what other provinces have. We come home and say, phew, we're in Alberta. It's not a perfect system. I don't know what any system is, but I'll just mention a couple of things. For one thing, it's a system whose funding is decreasing at a very significant rate, provincial funding. From language assessment and referral in Edmonton, I got a very simple message when I asked, what should I be talking about? The message is this: clients want to find meaningful employment that will help them provide for their families and build a better life in Canada. Whether that client is a CLB 2 or CLB 10, the message is the same. And you'll note what they said was meaningful employment and to provide for their families, not minimum wage jobs that won't cover the rent. Well, what is meaningful employment, and how do you get it? Let's just take an example of an internationally educated nurse leaving CLB with, leaving Link with CLB 5 and 6. What are her options? Well, to become a registered nurse, the language requirements are, on the CELBAN test, the Canadian English Language Benchmarks for Nurses test, listening 10, writing 7, speaking 8, reading 8, or a 7.5 on the IELTS, or overall 7.0 on the IELTS with a listening score of 7.5, reading 6.5, 7.0 in writing, and 7.0 in speaking. And just to put that into perspective for you, universities generally require a 6.5 on the IELTS for entry into a bachelor's degree. But if you're trying to get into a nursing program, like an RN, a Bachelor of Science in Nursing at a university, the language requirements are generally the CARNA ones, the Nursing Association, and those are those 10, 8, 7, 7. As another point of comparison, CLB 12 is the language level of an educated native speaker. CLB 10 is pretty darn close to native proficiency. So it's a high demand. Okay, so if you can't reach that level of language proficiency in the time that's available to you, let's try, well, LPN then. Well, for that you need English 30-1. That's high school English, grade 12, with a 60% pass mark, or a 6.5 on the IELTS, or CELBAN 10, 8, 7, 8. So if you take the CELBAN, the requirements for an LPN are the same as for an RN, but if you take the IELTS, they're a whole point lower. There's an opportunity here for language experts to inform professional organizations regarding the impact and the inconsistency of their ELP requirements. Completing English 30-1 demonstrates minimal requirements for listening and speaking. English 30 is not an English language course, and it doesn't add any language necessarily to the learner. But, well, okay, maybe you can't get the funding to take all of the ESL you need for LPN, because you do have to get up there to, pretty high level. So how about healthcare aid? It's at least a step on the way. Well, to get into a healthcare aid program in Alberta, you need CLB 7. It's one of the lowest possible requirements for a program of study in a community college that'll lead to employment at $15 to $20 an hour. And if you have children and pay rent and pay for daycare and so on, that's barely going to get you through the month. So you can see that CLB 7 is actually not a lot in terms of what it takes to get and keep a job. Employers know the importance of language skills and soft skills, and I was glad to hear the mention of intercultural skills from the Safeway representative, because those are very important skills. We often get calls from employers looking for English courses for their employees, but quite often the employers can't allocate either the time or the funds necessary, and I would like to say that quite often it's a question of time. We say, well, when can your employers be available? And they're like, well, after work. Usually after an 8-hour day, they're not really at their prime for language learning, which is kind of a significant investment of energy. So the limits to CIC funding of LINC keeps the learners from reaching even the lowest language requirement needed for a half-decent career. So if they're exiting LINC before they get to a CLB 7 all around, even healthcare aid is out of reach. Actually, you're not even guaranteed that CLB 5-6 course in Alberta. There are waiting lists for LINC, and there aren't enough LINC 5 and 6 classes available. Well, what about the provincial funding then? This funding comes from Alberta Human Services through Alberta Works. You can't actually apply for Alberta Works funding if you're a permanent resident and you haven't completed at least LINC 5 with us, or CLB 5 all around. You'll be turned back to the LINC system, which didn't have a class for you because the system is overloaded. But let's say you have the magic 5 or 6 and you apply for funding. What now? Well, funding levels fluctuate from institution to institution and from year to year, and in recent years the drift has been consistently downwards. So if you're very lucky and you meet all the 23 conditions, you get into a funded ESL program. Now, this is another area where the system disadvantages the higher level learner with more advanced career goals. Alberta Works funding is logically enough intended to get clients into employment. I have no argument with that goal. Better paid employment, of course, wherever possible, as quickly as possible. It is not primarily intended to help people get into post-secondary studies or any kind of career study, although many learners have in fact been able to use the program in that way. So it's a bit of an impasse. Employers don't understand or recognize foreign credentials or foreign work experience. So the road to meaningful employment goes through the post-secondary institutions, yet those programs don't appear to be on the radar of either CIC or Human Services. So there is a bit of a mismatch between learner goals and funder goals. Okay, in a minute. All right, next slide comes up in a second. Of course, we know that immigration rules have changed and there will be fewer people admitted to Canada with lower language skills. And yet, when you accept a primary applicant, you also accept his or her spouse and dependents. The spouse may be at a lower level. When we accept refugees, although we accept very few these days, the language requirements are waived as they are for family class entrants. Finally, Quebec has its own immigration system which requires French language skills, and quite a lot of immigrants in Quebec move west eventually. And then they need ESL because they have no English, and quite often they are citizens at this point, but so that they cannot access LINC. So there'll be no shortage of learners in the lower benchmarks for the foreseeable future, as well as a growth in the higher end. So the gaps in services. It's an aim problem. Let's go back one. Thanks. There is a gap between LINC and ESL, as I explained. There is a gap in goals between learner goals and funder goals. There are gaps in the assessment system. The CLB testing that's supported doesn't get learners where they're going, and it fails to support employers in determining the language levels of applicants. There are gaps for literacy learners, and wherever the learner doesn't fit the model that exists currently. We need new models that accommodate part-time learning, learning in the workplace, long-term language support at less intensive levels, literacy with workplace integration, learners with post-secondary goals. We need flexibility and new models. Post-secondaries can and should do a better job of managing transferability and laddering, so recognizing each other's program for access to post-secondary studies. There is a strong interest from the funder side in online learning and online professional development for teachers. Online learning has potential, but online language learning works best in a blended format. If you could sit at home learning a language all by yourself, more people would do that. There are no shortage of online programs, they just don't work all that well. There needs to be support for professional development. TESOL Ontario, for example, works quite well with CIC on approving courses for professional development and ongoing PD for their ongoing certification requirements. It looks like an interesting model to us. So moving on to strengths and opportunities. Well, we do have a system. We have LINC and we have provincially funded ESL, and that's a lot more than a lot of other people have, and it needs to be recognized. The province of Alberta has long been a leader in how it funds ESL and also how it funds innovative programming. There is no question at all that there is the will and the desire to support newcomers to succeed, and that is a very great strength. We have to build on that commitment with some new thinking and some smart programming and planning to direct resources where they'll do the most good. Closer cooperation among funders, among language programs and the settlement sector. In Alberta, to the best of my knowledge, the government representatives are working very well together, and that's a strength that we can build further on. The language sector's representation. There's growing representation from the language sector on the National Committee. This is a very promising and welcome initiative. Overall, though, the language sector needs a stronger voice in identifying the issues for the province and for CIC. I'd suggest something maybe like a joint conference or some sort of formalized communication bridge between the language sector and the funders. At the ATESL conference last week, ESL program directors took the first step towards forming a committee to coordinate information and concerns and to formulate a concerted response to government funders on the issues that we see. And we hope that this will work towards a clearer understanding of the issues. Another strength is that we have a lot of capacity in the language training system. We have expertise, we have research, we have space, dedicated professionals, ESL programs that are nimble and able to make rapid change and adjustment as funders request. We in the ESL world, from the TESOL programs at the universities down through the programs, researchers, teachers, assessors, advisors, can provide our expertise and our experience to the question of how best to serve the learner populations. Let's use this expertise better, and let's get evidence to support future direction. If we want to improve settlement and integration outcomes for newcomers, we need to better coordinate and target the available funds and tools. Better communication and cooperation across levels of government, the settlement sector, and the language sector will be required. Thank you.